Good evening. My name is Diane Friedman, and we are going to get started in a minute. We have some participants that are still joining us. Welcome. Okay, we're going to get started. And good evening and welcome to Danville's Housing Element 101 workshop. My name is Diane Friedman. I am the Deputy Director of Development Services for the town of Danville. We are joined by Dave Crompton, who's Danville's Chief of Planning, Kat Bravo, who is the Administrative Analyst in the Development Services Department, and Diana Elrod, who is our consultant, who is working with us on the housing element update process. We are so pleased to have a conversation with you about housing, as what happens on this subject at the community level is now governed by state laws. As an overview, the intent of this workshop is to inform, and will therefore cover three primary areas. The first is background and context to the housing element and what is impacting decisions around the housing element update process. The second is we're probably going to share more than you've ever wanted to know about the housing element. And the third is how you can participate in the process and the roles of the elected and appointed town officials. So in essence, we'll cover the why, the what, the how, and the who. And lastly, we will be here to answer any questions that you may have. Next slide, please. So before we get started, rather than talking at you for the entirety of this session, we've structured this workshop to be interactive. So as a warm-up activity, we'd like to see if you could help us get a better sense of our audience by taking a Zoom survey poll that will appear on your screen. Please select the option that best describes where you live. I live in Danville. I work in Danville. I shop, dine, and/or play in Danville. All of the above. All right, we're almost okay. We've got everybody and the results. Four people. Do we have the results, Kat?
Yeah, so it looks like 4 live in Danville. We have 1 person that works in Danville. We have 4 people that shop, dine, and/or play in Danville, and 1 person is all of the above.
Okay, thank you. All right, moving on to the next slide. So we'd like to set the stage for our discussion today with some of the background and the context around the housing element update process. Next slide, please. And we want to start by acknowledging that for a long time now, it has been very expensive to live in California. But as a 2015 report by the State Legislative Analyst's Office illustrates, the disparity between California's housing costs and the rest of the nation has grown dramatically over the decades. Starting in the 1940s, the California home prices were 20% above the US. In 1980, 80% above the US. In 2015, 150% above the US. In 2019, 218% above the US. If you look at average rents for California, the average is $1,503 a month, and this is throughout the entire state. As as compared to $1,062 per month as far as rental income. So, we're just acknowledging what we're all very aware of. It is very expensive to live and afford housing in the state of California. Next slide, please. Looking more at housing trends, the Legislative Analyst Report Office illustrates that how growth in housing costs is the result of a housing supply shortage. Again, from the 1940s on, you can see how there was housing in the 400,000s, and then dramatically you see a drop towards the 2000s, and this is along the California coast, and most of our major metropolitan areas are along the California coast. So you can start to see the trend is that housing has moved from the coast and it is moving inland, continuing, the long commutes, people trying to find housing away from major metropolitan areas, and a continued stress on housing costs and housing shortage as we move into the 2000s. Next slide, please. Further annual permitting, the Legislative Analyst Report conclusions that reflect that in the Department of Housing and Community Development, the number of permits issued for housing units, a leading indicator of housing construction, has never recovered from the Great Recession of 2008. Again, from 1954, if you look across from 1954 up until 2016, at the most, the state permits a little bit above 300,000. If you look from 2008 forward, we have not been able to reach anything over 100,000 permits per year. Again, this is really causing the shortage of housing and pressure on the housing market and the pricing. Next slide, please. So as we look at this, why is this? The Legislative Analyst Office, and they're an independent office in the state legislature. They believe that it's due to 5 primary factors. The first is community resistance to growth, especially in a suburban area like Danville. Noise, traffic, congestion, people in communities, suburban communities, there is resistance to growth. There's an attractiveness of higher tax generating land uses, limited land to build on given California's geography. We showed that a little bit more along the coastal areas. It's starting to move inward. The cost of development is very, very high, and project delays due to lengthy review processes and abuse of the California Environmental Quality Act, otherwise known as CEQA, to stop new housing developments. So, going back to the attractiveness of higher generating tax revenue generating land uses, commercial property generates a lot more tax revenue. So, if you're looking at the stress and the cost to build, it is very, very expensive to build. The town of Danville does not build housing. We zone for housing. Developers have to fund the projects, and the housing costs and funding these projects are consistently and continue to be very expensive and high risk projects. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about the legislative focus and Governor Newsom's housing goal. Prior to the pandemic, housing production was a central focus for Governor Newsom, whose inaugural address included a goal of building 3.5 million housing units by 2025. This is a stretch goal at best, because that means the entire state would need to produce over 850,000 units annually in the next 4 years. And as you saw that permit slide earlier, that is far more than we have ever built in this state. Next slide, please. Housing has also been a priority of our state legislature. Over 64 bills have been passed over the past 4 years that are intended to expedite housing construction. In 2021 alone, 28 bills have been introduced, with Senate Bill 9 receiving press attention given its intent to eliminate single-family residential zoning. If there is one takeaway from part one of this workshop, it is that state laws, not local laws, now increasingly govern how cities must review, approve, and plan for housing. There are two bills right now that are making its way to the governor's desk. Senate Bill 9 eliminates single-family zoning. By right, a developer as of January 1, 2022, can come into our building department and submit a permit to build a duplex on any single-family lot in the town of Danville or in the state of California when this bill is signed by Governor Newsom, and it should be signed by October 30th. And this is one of the housing bills that we feel like the state has just put a blanket approach to housing production. The state feels that housing production is going to lower the price of housing. And we feel that a one-size-fits-all approach is not the best way for each community to plan for their housing. Next slide, please. As we transition to the housing element within this social political context, I'd like to pass it over to Diana to dive into the nuts and bolts of a housing element and what it means to Danville.
Thank you, Diane. Let's get right off the bat, ask, why do we need a housing element? And the short answer is to comply with state housing element law that dates all the way back to 1969. Housing element law and all of its related legislation acknowledges that cities do not build housing, as Diane mentioned, and instead it requires each city or jurisdiction to accommodate its fair share of the state's projected housing need. And we do this by planning for growth and removing constraints to growth. Next slide, please. And as Diane noted earlier, a growing number of recently adopted state laws now collectively constrain how cities develop their housing elements. And this is just a short list of some of the ones that have the most important impacts on the work that we do. Next slide. So what is a housing element anyway? It's a plan that demonstrates to the state of California, because they have to approve it, how we would accommodate the housing that is needed in the community. And the key here is that the state and regional agencies, not the town, determine what the need is. The housing element is the only element of the general plan that must be approved by the state. And it has to be updated every year, every 8 years. The period that we are developing a plan for is 2023 to 2031. Next slide, please. There we go. So what is in the housing element? It includes a housing plan with goals, policies, and objectives, an analysis of housing needs, evaluation of constraints, and identification of sites that could be developed for housing. And this is perhaps the most controversial aspect of housing element law. Next slide, please. We are going to take yet another quiz. Here we go. So we've talked a lot about projected housing needs. So I want to ask you, which group do you believe is in charge of developing those housing projections? We'll display the results in 30 seconds. Either the federal government, state government, regional government, city councils or boards of supervisors, or other. Here is the poll. You only get one choice, so make it really good. Okay, do we have responses, Kat? So One person said the federal government, 3 said the state government, 3 said regional government, and that's all we had as a response. And the answer is a combination of the state and regional governments, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. This slide shows that the foundation of the housing element is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment or allocation, pronounced RHNA, which involves 3 levels of government in total. The state's role is to produce housing projections every year, 8 years, and these targets are then assigned to regions within California, like the San Francisco Bay Area. And the state assigned the Bay Area 441,176 units for this next cycle. This is more than 2.5 times what it was the last cycle, which was about 189,000 units. The next is the role of the regional planning agency to allocate that assignment to individual cities and counties. And then lastly, only at the very end of the process do local cities and counties play a role. And our designated role is to find the land that could accommodate this housing assignment. Next slide, please. So what does it mean for Danville? And right now, the assignment that we've been given, the draft assignment, it means we have to find land parcels for a minimum of 2,241 units for the 8-year planning cycle from 2023 to 2031. And note that this is a minimum assignment, which we'll explain a little bit more later. Next slide, please. Danville's housing assignment, it's important to realize that 2,241 new units are not just single family homes, but homes that have to be affordable in 4 separate income categories. Generally speaking, lower income households will be accommodated through multifamily housing. It's the only way to do it in a way that makes the project quote unquote pencil. Each income category is benchmarked to a percentage of the county's area median income. And as a reference point, Contra Costa County's AMI area median income for a family of 4 is $119,000 per year. What that means is, as a median, it means there are an equal number of households above that earn above $119,000 a year as below $119,000 a year. That's what it means by median. And at one end of the spectrum, a very low income family of 4 would earn 50% of the median, in which case is about $65,000 per year. So this is a household with 2 parents, maybe want to stay at home parent, and 2 children, school-age children, and the main breadwinner earns $65,000 a year. That's a very low income household in this area. And at the other end of the spectrum, an above moderate income family of 4 earns in excess of $143,000 a year. And these income categories matter because higher density zoned land is necessary, as I mentioned, according to the state, to provide units affordable to the lower end of the income spectrum. So for example, in the allocation that we've received, the units affordable to the lowest income categories must be built to at least 30 units per acre. Next slide, please. There's a lot of information on this slide, and we're not going to go through everything, but you can see that Danville here, where Danville rests according to the remainder of the county. You can see at the first, Antioch has over 3,000 units, Concord over 5,000 units that have been allocated, Richmond about 3,600 units, San Ramon 5,000 units plus. Unincorporated areas of the county got the largest share at almost 7,700 units. So within the spectrum, you can see that all of the jurisdictions have a substantially larger allocation than the last housing element. Next slide, please. So who did give this assignment? Who is this regional agency? It's the San Francisco Planning Agency, and it's called the Association of Bay Area Governments, and it's pronounced ABAG. And one of ABAG's responsibility was to develop a methodology to distribute the 441,000 units that the state handed to the Bay Area. And then they were responsible for this methodology to split up all those units it's 101 cities and 9 counties in the Bay Area. Next slide, please. We have yet another activity. So what do you think ABAG considered as the main factor used in its methodology to allocate units of those 441,000 units? Was it cities with high socioeconomic resources, access to jobs, access to transit, cities with enough natural resources to support growth, et cetera, or some other factor? Do we have the answer? No one cited cities with high socioeconomic resources. The 2 of 5 people who responded access to jobs, 3 said access to transit, and 1 person said cities with enough natural resources to support growth. In fact, it's not really any of those exactly. It depends on which income category you're dealing with. Could we have the next slide, please? So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this chart. This is a chart that was provided by ABAG. We didn't make it, so you know, if you have specific questions about it, we will might have to do some research. But it does tell you that how they allocated the units can be sort of split down the middle, that the units on the left-hand side were the orange boxes that say very low and low. The factors that they included were access to high resource or high opportunity areas, access to jobs via auto, and access to jobs via transit. At the other end, for moderate and above moderate income, there was not really the same breakdown. It was actually access to high opportunity areas, but the greatest weight was given to job proximity. That is, how if a person could get to their job within 30 minutes by driving a car. Next slide, please. So what's at stake for noncompliance? And some have already asked, and this is always a big question, what happens if the town decides not to comply and not come up with enough sites zoned at appropriate densities to accommodate these units? What happens is that immediately the town becomes unable to access certain kinds of funding that's available at the state, especially transportation dollars used to repave and repair roads. It could result in court-imposed fines up to $600,000 a month. And even if Danville residents were willing to forego that revenue in form of state funding and basically pay fines, there's a huge legal risk involved in a substantial loss of control. The courts can mandate our compliance by approving housing developments on our behalf without any input from the community, suspending the town's ability to issue permits and so forth, and overall taking over the process of development from the town to a court. Next slide, please. With that, we're going to share a little case study, and I'm going to hand it over to Dave.
Thank you, Diana, and good evening, everybody. So Diana, in one of the early slides, she showed our total RHNA number at 2,241, and it's broken down into different income levels, including the low and very low. And so I want to do a case study to kind of go through and show kind of the challenges and hardship we have, and other cities like Danville have, in providing for those, especially the low and very low income units. And I want to use the Alexon Riverwalk project as an example, as a case study. So you probably are all familiar with this. This is the new apartment, 144 unit apartment project that was built by Trammell Crow. It's down off Diablo Road on the south side, right there by the on-ramp. And the site was actually a site that was part of our last housing element when we had a RHNA assignment and we had some low and very low income units. We changed the designation of this site from office to multifamily up to 30 units an acre. And so we expected that at 30 units an acre, since the state accepts that as housing for low and very low, we expected to get low and very low income housing on the site. But what happened is that, number one, the developer invoked what's known as state density bonus law. And on one of those early slides, it listed all those state laws. This was one of those. And what this basically says is that if a developer is willing to commit some of the units to be affordable, then they automatically get a density bonus and additional units. And that's even if it goes above the general plan density range. And so in this case, they invoke state density bonus law, and it's really there's the town can't say no to it, and it's pretty clear cut. There's a kind of a chart that says if you provide X amount of affordability, you get X number of additional units. So in this case, they provided 10 units that are affordable to very low income households. And the remaining 134 units are now renting at market rate. And in Danville, because of very high land costs and development costs, those market rate units are renting at like $2,600 to almost $5,000 a month. And so those are above moderate rates. And so because we thought we were going to get 144 affordable units on the site, and we only got 10, that means that we are now have a problem with another state law that was shown earlier on the chart, and that's called the no net loss law. Basically says that if you have a site that you said as part of your housing element was going to provide a certain type of housing, in this case lower income, and it didn't provide that, then you automatically have to make that up somewhere else, or you're out of compliance with your housing element. And so that puts us in a position where we only got 10 instead of 144, and going into our new housing element, we're already have to find another 134 units. And that's why earlier Diana said that the 2,241 was kind of a minimum number of housing units, because the state wants us to provide a buffer, 15%, maybe a 30% buffer over and beyond that number. And that would make sure that if we have additional sites that we had counted on for lower income, low and very low income, and we don't get it, we have a buffer of other sites that are still available that we can point to that could provide for that income, those rental rates. So you can see that, Danville, this is going to be an ongoing problem without some type of help as far as state or federal subsidies or low or nonprofit housing groups that have those types of subsidies. We're going to see the same type of problem on every site, because at market rate in Danville, given the costs of development, they are not going to be affordable unless there are subsidies. Next slide, please. And so to take that a little bit further, this is a concept called housing cost burden, and this comes from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, and it basically says there's a number that if a household has to devote more than 30% of its income towards housing, including utilities, then it's housing cost burdened. And so that basically means that if they have to spend more than 30%, then there's maybe not enough resources for that family to provide for other needs and wants of the family. Next slide, please. And so digging a little bit deeper, this takes it into Danville and shows where we stand as far as housing cost burdening. And so this is a list of multifamily developments that have been approved in Danville over maybe the last 20 years. We went out and did a survey and looked at the rental rates. And so this is basically looking at the very low and moderate income numbers that Diana went through earlier, and shows what would be the cost burden for the different income levels for these existing projects. And you can see that for very low income households, there are not any units in any of those projects that would not cost burden those households. For low, there are a few, about half and half. And then there's a few more at moderate. And so what really, one of the takeaways here is that if you look at the Alexon downtown Riverwalk, which is the most recent project that reflects the current land costs, you can see that there is nothing in there that at market rate without those 10 subsidized or the 10 deed restricted units. None of those units would be available to very low or moderate at market rate. So in order to afford any of those apartment units and not be cost burdened, you'd have to be an above moderate household. Next slide, please. So hopefully now we've kind of got your interest level up and maybe even some levels of concern. And so you probably want to follow us along and maybe talk to your friends and neighbors and family and get them involved as well. We have, from the very beginning, we've known that there's going to be a high RHNA number and high number of units that we're going to have to try to find a way to accommodate as part of this housing element. And there are so many state laws that affect our local ability to do that, that we want to make sure that the community is informed and involved as we go through this process, so that you can help us kind of focus and prioritize how we might want to go about identifying which sites might be the best sites to change the zoning general plan on to accommodate and to create more housing sites. And so we began earlier this year. We're doing these types of housing workshops. We've done throughout the spring and late spring and into the summer. We've also reached out to other groups, some in person and some via Zoom, such as the Kiwanis, the local realtors groups. We are getting ready to meet with the Chamber of Commerce and the veterans groups and some others. So if you have a group that you'd like us to come and talk to, we'd be very happy to do that. So we've created some very hopefully useful websites and portals that have information, links to the state laws, and some tools to help kind of look at the different options we have for housing locations. And I'm going to leave that up to Diane. She's going to talk a little bit more about those websites that we have. As far as our process going forward and the tasks that we have to complete. So by this next spring and summer, so less than a year from now, we're going to have to be moving pretty far forward with this. We're going to have to start identifying the specific sites around town that we are looking at. And we're going to have to do some environmental review for those sites. And so we have hired a environmental consultant to prepare a environmental impact report to look at potential impacts such as traffic, noise, air quality, biologic impacts, cultural resource impacts, and all the other areas that are studied by an EIR. We're working on the other kind of non-controversial technical components of the housing element. That's kind of the background information and the profile of Danville housing characteristics. Once we have a draft housing element together, we have to submit it to HCD, the state agency that oversees our development of the housing element. And they take 60 days to review and get back to us on whether they think our draft housing element is compliant with state law. If it is, great, we'll move forward. If not, we'll have to fix it and then move forward. And so ultimately, we will be going through public hearings with it, and it will need to be adopted and presented to the state by the end of January of 2023. So about a year and a half. Next slide, please. And the specific review and approval process will include a couple of our Danville decision-making bodies. The first one is our Planning Commission, which is a actually 8, but 7 acting person body of volunteers, community members appointed by the town council. So they will look at the environmental impact report, public input, the draft housing element, and they will review all that and make a recommendation to the town council. And ultimately, the town council will be in a position to adopt the housing element, and at the same time to adopt any rezoning and general plan changes we will have to make to upzone properties for multifamily housing to meet our RHNA assignment. And they will also review the environmental impact report. Again, that needs to be done by January of 2023. Next slide, please. And so, Diana, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk a little bit more in depth about our website and tools that we have there. And you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I always do that. I'm what is referred to as an overmuter. I just want to point out to everybody that's participating on this webinar today that we are here for questions and answers. If you have a question, please feel free to type it into the Q&A as part of the Zoom process. and or you can type it into the chat. We want to reach out to everybody, and we want your feedback throughout this whole process. We have launched what is an online engagement portal. You can go to www.danvilletowntalks.org. Its express purpose is to serve as the source of facts, not fiction, about laws and processes that are governing this whole housing element update process that we're going through right now. This is a portal that will capture and respond to your questions. It will inform the decision-making process with your ideas. So we highly encourage you to visit our online engagement portal. There is no other type of social media out there or electronic form of communication where you can talk to us both ways. And we are very anxious to hear your comments and feedback. Next slide, please. And through the portal, and if you have your phone, I'm going to jump way to the bottom. You can text us right now you can text us with contributing ideas. We want to hear your housing story. We're very interested in people that own, people that rent, all different income categories. We want to hear from everybody. Please tell us your Danville housing story. Please tell us your story or your ideas about the housing and what we're planning for and where you think would be a great idea for it to be. If you want to text any of those ideas right now, the number is 838-484-3328. And please pass this information on. You can subscribe to our news feed at danvilletowntalks.org/housing element. You will learn more about housing and its governing legislation to provide informed input. You can attend our workshops. As Dave mentioned, we are more than happy to come out and speak to any community group that would like to have us. We've been very actively engaged on social media. It's been in our newsletters. We have sent surveys out in our newsletter. You can contribute to an idea on how we can accommodate the assigned growth while retaining what we feel as our small town atmosphere, outstanding quality of life, how to plan for these numbers. Next slide, please. We have one more housing workshop on September 18th. We will also have a housing workshop on October 7th, where we will be talking with the chamber businesses. So if you would like to participate in those, we will be sending out information on that as well. Next slide, please. If you are interested in state legislation, there is a lot going on. And as we mentioned earlier, that, the state is really, really trying to produce housing to really try and balance the imbalance right now and the housing shortage. And more that is taking away our ability to plan at the local level. We have legislative committee meetings every month that we provide legislative updates. They're public meetings, they're posted. We also provide a legislative update at the town council meetings, and it's the second meeting of the month. If you're interested in hearing about legislative updates, we have a legislative framework where you can read more about legislative principles of the town. And we also coalesce with the cities of Livermore, Pleasanton, Dublin, and San Ramon, which gives us a regional voice in Sacramento. And we are very actively involved in advocating on behalf of Danville and the region as far as bills that are impacting the town. I have the slide is your state senator, Steve Glazer, District 7, and you are represented by Assembly Member Rebecca Bauer-Cahan. These are your elected officials that are voting on the legislation that is impacting Danville. Next slide, please. Okay, now we are at the question and answer session. And Kat, do we have any questions that have come in?
Yeah, so we have one question right now. The question is, with years of drought in California, how do we provide enough water for those multiple dwellings?
Well, I can tell you, at least from the sort of housing element standpoint, we have to discuss a number of what are some of the constraints to housing. And one of those is infrastructure, and that would include also water. I know that it will be dealt with also in the environmental assessment. Remember that we have to plan for this housing. It doesn't necessarily mean that this housing is going to get built. But we do look towards understanding the impacts of additional units and what would be required in order to have actual development take place.
Great. Our next question is, I am a Danville resident. Should I be fearful that open space near my home can easily be chosen as a possible site for housing development? Is it possible to build all these new houses out in the outer areas of Danville, such as the land out Camino Tasahara towards Dublin? There seems to be a lot of land out there rather than try to squeeze the houses near current homes.
Sure, I can take a stab at answering that. So, the town of Danville values its open space, and that is really been one of our main themes of development over the years is, cluster development. If we have a site that has, kind of hillside area that has lands that are higher up and more visible, we want to transfer the development down below and create that as permanent open space. And so, those types of areas would not be areas that we would be looking to add housing back into. There could be vacant or open space areas that might be right along a boulevard or that type of area that might make sense to look at. I mean, there's nothing, we're looking for a lot of units. We wouldn't want to put housing, in an existing neighborhood in open space. That just doesn't make sense. So I don't think that that a person would need to fear that open space near them that would be developed. As far as building out to the east, as you got Camino Tasahara beyond where we have, some of the development that was actually county development out past the middle school out there, there's the county imposed urban limit line. So there's out there where you get into more of the ag lands, that's areas that don't have services like East Bay Mud and Central Sanitary Sewer Service. So we are looking at areas out in that direction, east side of town. Probably the areas that seem to make the most sense would be areas along, that have lesser commutes that would be near the freeway, maybe underutilized parcels in those areas. But those are right now. It's kind of all on the table, and we're looking for feedback as to how we should prioritize those types of locations.
Okay, thanks, Steve. The next question is, what are some of the benefits of new housing? Would it increase tax revenues for the city or supply more customers for local businesses?
I think that the tax revenue, yes, there's land values that would go up. Danville being a town that incorporated in 1982, depending on the area of town that you're in, we get a pretty small amount of the 2% property tax. So that's not a driver for Danville. As far as the services we provide probably cost more than the tax revenues we would get from new land development and new higher tax rates for newly developed lands. What was the second part of that question?
I think you covered it, the revenues for the city and then the customers for local businesses.
Yeah, the upside is that if you get new development, especially in the downtown area, like the Riverwalk or other, the Danville Hotel project, mixed use projects like that, we think there is a benefit to downtown businesses because you have people right there within walking distance of the restaurants and stores. So that's a plus.
Great. The next question we have is a resident who lives out on Lawrence Road in Danville, and her husband moved there because it was county and there was the 1 acre minimum. So she's asking at this point, the state can change this 1 acre minimum to multiple units on 1 acre.
Yeah, I mean, I think that question gets back to the SB 9 information that Diane provided earlier, and that, I guess that has recently passed through the state assembly and is headed for the governor's desk, where it is expected to be signed. And so that basically would say that any single family residential property in Danville and in the state can subdivide without any public hearing process or any discretionary review and approval by the town. So yes, that would be a concern. And but as far as the towns looking for RHNA sites and what have you, the Lawrence Road specific plan area was a pretty carefully planned area, and it's so far away from the freeway and from transit, that's not an area that I think we've identified any sites out there that would be potential housing sites. But we're open for suggestions.
Okay, the next question is, does the town use eminent domain?
The town has used eminent domain, I think maybe twice since incorporation. It's not a power that our town councils over the years have used lightly or have wanted to use. It is within the police powers that local jurisdictions have, and it's something that the town could consider. But if you're talking about the housing sites, I think I don't know if we touched on this enough earlier, but what the town's duties are as part of the housing element is to provide lands that are available for multifamily housing. A property owner does not have to build on it. So you could, if it was changed to multifamily and a property owner liked the way that the property is being used now, there isn't a requirement to build. It's just that land is available for development if somebody wanted to come along and develop it. So we wouldn't anticipate using eminent domain for any of these any sites for redevelopment.
The next question is a hot question. Do you have a preliminary site inventory put together where you can start to look at different sites that might be viable for upzoning?
We're going through the town now, and we are kind of looking at areas, different regions of the town. But we're not really focusing in on the individual sites yet, as far as sites that we want to start talking to the public about. We really are at this point, we want to gain input from the community and to help us kind of try to prioritize sites. We do have to, because we have to start an environmental impact report that's going to kind of look at traffic generated from different areas of town. We are doing kind of general, what if this number of housing units were developed in this part of town kind of studies, but we're not really ready to focus in and talk publicly about individual sites.
Great. The next question is, one of the goals of the housing element to make housing more affordable for first-time home buyers?
It most definitely could be a goal. I think one of the things that the analysis that looks at, what the needs are in the community, as well as ways to address housing affordability as we come up with that definitely could be a goal. The question for things like that is always, where's the funding coming from? And how would it be administered? But it's certainly a possibility for one of many kinds of goals that could be in the housing element.
No, and I just wanted to add on to this. When we look at the proposed legislation, like an SB 9 that would allow a duplex on a residential or a lot split that would allow up to 3 additional units on a single family lot. Part of the feedback to the legislators is that there is not an affordability component in these bills, and that what needs to happen is the state needs to be invested in building low and extremely low income housing. And it costs the same amount to construct a low and extremely low unit than it does a market rate unit. So if the state is not investing the funds in the form of either loans or with nonprofits to build this, we're incentivizing developers to build market rate housing. So we definitely feel that there needs to be more low and extremely low income housing. And the only way that that will be generated is if the state invests financially in this process.
Great. The next question is, how does an ADU fit into the formula, if at all? And on that, how much do we think ADUs can cover the RHNA numbers?
I can take the first part of it, and I can leave it to Dave to talk about the second part of it. Yes, until this housing element cycle, it would be difficult to count ADUs. But now that because the state said you couldn't count on it, them being built. But the state now does allow for jurisdictions to include some projection in the number of ADUs in each jurisdiction over the 8-year planning period based on previous production or most recent production. And the state is also going to allow jurisdictions to assign some of those units as very low, and moderate income rather than all at the above moderate income category. I know that I'm going to hand it off to Dave, and he can talk a little bit about the efforts that the town has taken to address ADUs locally.
Sure, thank you. So, we've always considered ADUs as a good way to incorporate more affordable housing into neighborhoods. And it seems to be popular. People like to have ADUs, and they're not controversial, like a higher density project might be down the street. And so we have encouraged those over the years with our development standards and our ADU ordinance. Last year, we used some funds that we got from the state to actually develop an ADU program called our Garden Cottage program, where we hired 2 architects. We developed 3 different size floor plans, each with different architectural elevations. And so they're pre-designed and pre-plan checked structurally and electrically, and all the requirements that you would need to get a building permit. And so if someone in Danville wants to build an ADU, all they would have to do is download those plans for free. Since they're pre-plan checked, there's a lower permit fee, and all a property owner really has to do is provide a site plan showing where it's going to be on the property and get a permit so we can inspect it as it's being built. So ADUs, we did that so that we could maybe get more ADUs and project forward a higher number of ADUs, which will offset our RHNA number somewhat.
Great. The next question pertains to public groups and the involvement with our decision making. So how do we plan to deal with the NIMBY or the not in my backyard opposition to large developments?
This is an issue throughout the Bay Area, the concern that people have that any development is bad development. And I think that, and concerns about who is going to occupy some of this housing. And I think that, part of the effort that we're making with our, ongoing series of Housing 101 is really to help people understand, number one, the importance of providing for affordable housing in general, but housing across the board. And I think the more people understand about the needs, the more people are willing to look more favorably upon housing. There always will be people who are not happy about any sort of development or any sort of growth, but the reality is we're growing. We already have people here, and part of the reason the housing costs are so high is because there are not enough housing to accommodate all the people who want to live here. you know, that I just read a report that said, you know, to Diane's point, that, you know, whether it's an affordable housing unit or an above moderate income unit, it still pretty much costs the same, maybe some slightly less because it's, if it's in multifamily housing rather than a single family house. But a recent study by the Turner Center at Berkeley found that in the Bay Area, specifically, of affordable developments that have been built over the last, I think, 5 or 6 years, the average construction cost, hard costs of construction, were over $700,000. So you can see that a person who earns very low income can't afford that. And that's multifamily housing. That wasn't single family housing. So there's a real need for that housing, and everybody, I think, as I said, I think the educational aspect of this, of what we're trying to do this year, is really important.
Great. Okay, the next question we have is, have the town staff reached out to any large commercial property owners, or have property owners reached out to the town about upzoning properties to allow for housing?
Yeah, so that's a process that we will be going through. Again, we haven't really gotten to the site-specific, you know, housing sites for our potential upzonings yet. I mean, we have ideas just like everybody else. You know, it makes sense if you look at older, underutilized, you know, commercial sites or office sites near the freeway. You know, those are the types of sites that seem to make sense. There's an analysis we have to go through. The state won't just allow us to redesignate sites that really have no chance of redeveloping because they're currently economically viable, and property owner, you know, nobody who really is trying to maximize their profit or the potential on property would redevelop. So as we go forward and we identify sites that we think kind of make the first cut, we will be talking to those property owners, because it does help if they can give us information and, you know, and give us information that we can provide to the state that is a property that the property owner thinks would have interest in redeveloping. So that's kind of a process that we'll be going through in the next, you know, 6 months or so.
Great. And I think that is all we have.
I think there was one more that I saw, Kat. It was, I think it was in the chat. Let me see. It was about both East Bay for everyone and East Bay YIMBY would love to have a chat. If you are looking for more community groups to reach out to, both groups have members in Danville or have people that would like to move to Danville. You know, we are absolutely trying to reach out to all, like I said, all types of renters, homeowners, people that want to move to Danville to hear your housing stories, people that want to buy in Danville that are renting right now, people that want to rent. So, you know, what we encourage you to do is, if you could please visit our website and provide your housing stories, provide your input. We would love to hear it. It is very, very important that we hear from everyone during this process. So yes, thank you for reaching out to us, the people that live here, the people that want to live here, the people that can't afford to live here anymore. We want, you know, we want to hear these stories. And it's important that we get this information out on this portal so that we are reaching everyone that we possibly can, because this definitely is a process that we want everybody involved in.
Great. And that's all we got.
All right. Well, we want to thank you. Please, you know, we encourage you to continue to reach out to us. And if you have any questions, we're here. If you want to invite Dave and I to speak, we would be more than happy to come out. Thank you very much for participating. Please take advantage of the Town Talks portal and text us your information. And thanks again. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.